Why do all four Why do all four Gospels contain different versions of the inscription on the cross? Does the fact that all four Gospels contain different versions of the inscription of the cross indicate error? By no means. Both Luke and John tells us that the inscription of the cross of Jesus was written in three languages: Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. It is therefore a reasonable assumption that three of the Gospel writers each chose to quote a different language, and that one writer chose to quote the words in common to the other three. The inscriptions. Let us begin. Matthew 27:37 says, "And they set up over his head his accusation written." Mark 15:26 says, "And the superscript of his accusation was written over." And Luke 23:38 says, "And the superscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew." In John 19:19, it says that Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. This is the actual inscription of Matthew 27:37. "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." In Mark 15:26, it says, "the King of the Jews." Luke 23:38 says, "This is the King of the Jews." And John 19:19 says, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." What was the significance of using these three languages? It was custom of the Romans to use gypsum letters written on a rough board affixed to a cross to proclaim the reason why a person was being executed. Although three languages was not always used. Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire. It represented human government, power, and conquest. Greek was the international language of culture. It represented human wisdom, art, and commerce. Hebrew was the religious language of the Jews. It represented the covenant race, the law of God, and the means by which man made himself known to God made himself known to man. In the providence of God, all these human and divine institutions were addressed when Jesus was crucified. How did this come about? The most probable scenario is that the Roman governor Pilate dictated the title in Latin, and the centurion in charge of the execution implemented the edict and its translation into the other languages. The words "King of Jews" was a public sneer by the Jews at the Jews by Pilate, and this was compounded by his additional taunt that their king came from Nazareth, i.e., that he was a despised Galilean. And John, as John is the only gospel writer who mentions Pilate or Nazareth, or who calls the inscription a title, it is abundantly evident that John is quoting the Latin from which is read, "Isus Nazareth Rex Ivadorium." Latin used I and V where English uses J and U. That this is in Latin is further confirmed by the fact that the early church adopted the symbol, the Latin letters INRI, which are the first letters of each of this inscription only. And this symbol appears in many other early paintings of the crucifixion. In Luke was a highly educated man, a physician. You can find that in Colossians 4:14, and he addressed the gospel to a Greek nobleman, the most excellent Theophilus of Luke 1:3. It is therefore very reasonable to suppose that Luke gives us the Greek inscription above, right here. Matthew wrote for the Jews, and many other quotations from the Old Testament show that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah. It is therefore most likely that Matthew quotes the Hebrew inscription as seen below. See drawing below. Mark. This leaves Mark, whose gospel is shorter than the other three, and who gives us a somewhat abbreviated account on the life of Jesus, as his purpose is to tell us more about what Jesus did than what Jesus said. For example, he omits the birth of Jesus, as well as the whole of the Sermon on the Mount and several other discourses. True to his style, Mark abbreviates the inscription of the words common to the three languages, namely, the King of the Jews, on the board. Now comes the most interesting part. The Latin title, being the official indictment, would undoubtedly have been written first on the board, and then would have determined the length of the board and or the size of the letters required to fit the inscription on the line, and for it still to be readable by a crowd from a distance. John 19:20. In those days, they did not use spaces between words, if any, in the languages as we do now, so John's Latin title contained just 26 letters and no spaces. Luke's Greek subscription contains 30 letters, and so much have been written in slightly smaller letters than was in Latin. It is easy to see that there would not have been room for 16 more letters for the words Jesus of Nazareth, or i.e. Jesus the Nazarene in Greek. Matthew's accusation in Hebrew contained just 19 letters, which is rather fewer than the two other languages, because the Jews did not write vowels in Hebrew. Whoever translated the title into Hebrew apparently did not think it was worth adding of Nazareth, especially he thought that to have lived in Nazareth was not an indictable offense. If we put together all of this, it is highly probable that the board with the inscription looked like this below, with the Greek written first, with the Latin written first, probably at the top, and either Greek or Hebrew to follow. Although ancient Hebrew was dissimilar to the modern typewritten Hebrew script used here for convenience, the number of letters was the same.